Welcome back to the Josh Cruz Podcast, where we take ideas that are usually reduced to sound bites and slow them down enough to actually understand them. Sometimes that means theology, sometimes it means culture. Most of the time, it's both. This is the second episode in our 3-part series on a figure we think we know, but probably don't. Who is the devil? Part 2, how the accuser became Lucifer. Last time, we started in a place that probably felt strange to a lot of people. We didn't begin with horns, hell, rebellion, or a cosmic war. We began with a Hebrew word, Satan, an adversary, an accuser, someone who obstructs, someone who stands in the way. We saw that in the earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible, a Satan was not necessarily evil. David could be a Satan to the Philistines. The angel of the Lord could act as a Satan against Balaam. And when we finally met Ha-Satan, the accuser, in Job and Zechariah, he is not yet the enemy of God. He is a member of the court, a prosecutor, a tester, a figure who asks hard, cynical questions in God's presence. But we also saw the beginning of a shift. In the story of David's census, 2 Samuel says God incited David, but the later retelling in 1 Chronicles says Satan incited David. Same story, same census, different subject. That matters, because it shows the adversary beginning to carry more narrative weight. He is no longer merely standing in the court asking questions. He is beginning to act. He is beginning to incite. He is beginning to become a figure with agency. And today we're going to follow that development into stranger territory. Exile, Persia, cosmic dualism, Lucifer, fallen angels, watchers, Mastema, Belial. This is where the courtroom starts to become a battlefield. This is where the accuser starts to become the rebel. This is where the devil begins to look more like the figure most Christians think they already know. But the path there is not as simple as we often are taught, because the Bible does not hand us one clean origin story for Satan. There is no chapter that says, here is when the devil fell. There is no official biography, no single passage that gives us the whole thing. Instead, we get fragments, images, taunt songs, strange stories in the margins, Second Temple texts that most Christians have never read, and centuries of Jewish imagination trying to answer one question: where does evil come from? Not just human weakness, but the kind of evil that feels organized, ancient, intelligent, bigger than any one person. The kind of evil that builds empires, the kind that crushes the righteous, the kind that seems to have a mind of its own. That is the world we're entering now. The Babylonian exile changed Jewish theology because it changed Jewish life. It is one thing to talk about evil when you are living in your own land, worshiping in your own temple, under your own king. It is another thing to talk about evil when your city has been burned, your temple has been destroyed, your king has been humiliated, and your people have been dragged into a foreign empire. At that point, evil no longer feels like a private moral problem. It feels historical, political, cosmic. It has armies and borders and tax collectors. It has palace walls and imperial decrees. It has gods with names you don't worship and kings who think they rule the world. The older Hebrew texts are often comfortable saying that God is sovereign over everything, even calamity. Isaiah can say, I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. That is a fierce monotheism. God is not one power among many. He is not locked in an equal struggle with darkness. He reigns over all of it. But suffering puts pressure on that claim, because if God is good and God rules, then what do we do with Babylon? What do we do with Persia? What do we do with the righteous suffering under pagan empire? What do we do with the feeling that the world is not merely broken but occupied? After Babylon, and especially under Persian rule, Jewish people encountered a world shaped by Zoroastrian thought. Zoroastrianism framed reality as a cosmic conflict between forces of light and darkness, truth and falsehood, order and chaos. The good God, Ahura Mazda, stood opposed to Anra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. Judaism did not simply adopt that system. It did not become a religion of two equal gods. That's important. Jewish monotheism remained intact. But that way of seeing the world began to influence the imagination. The world started to look less like a classroom where God tests people and more like a battlefield where hostile powers resist God's purpose. Evil began to feel less like a moment and more like a kingdom, less like an event and more like an enemy. That is the soil where the cosmic devil grows, not because Jewish thought abandoned God's sovereignty, but because suffering demanded a larger vocabulary. The courtroom language was no longer enough. The prosecutor became too small. The accuser needed a darker story. And this is where many Christians reach for the name Lucifer. For a lot of people, Lucifer is the devil's original name, the name he had before he rebelled, the name attached to the beautiful angel before pride corrupted him and God cast him down. That story is so familiar that it feels biblical in the most direct sense, but the actual history is more complicated. The word Lucifer does not appear as Satan's personal name in the Hebrew Bible. It comes through Latin. The key passage is Isaiah 14. Where the prophet speaks a taunt song against the king of Babylon. This is important from the start. Isaiah tells us who he is mocking, a human king, the king of Babylon, the empire that rose high and crushed nations beneath it. In the taunt, Isaiah uses cosmic language. He mocks the king as one who tried to ascend to the heavens, raise his throne above the stars of God, sit on the Mount of Assembly, and make himself like the Most High. Then comes the famous line, "How you have fallen from heaven, O shining one, son of the dawn." In Latin, that shining one becomes Lucifer, light bearer, morning star, Venus, the bright star that rises in the morning and then disappears. That image is perfect for Babylon. Babylon shines, Babylon rises, Babylon looks untouchable. Babylon imagines itself heaven high. Then it falls. The Lucifer of Isaiah 14 is not originally a proper name for the devil. It is a poetic image aimed at a human tyrant. And the imagery likely draws from an older Canaanite myth about a lesser god named Athtar. In that myth, Athtar tries to sit on the throne of Baal on Mount Zaphon, but he is too small for the seat. His feet do not reach the footstool. He cannot occupy the place he tried to seize. So he descends to rule a lower realm. Isaiah takes that myth and turns it into a weapon against Babylon. He is saying, in effect, you thought you belonged on the throne of heaven, but you are too small for the seat. You are not divine. You are not eternal. You are not the Most High. You are going down to the pit. That is not a biography for Satan. It is a humiliation of empire. But that does not mean later Christians were crazy for seeing something satanic there. Because this is what Scripture often does with empire. It describes human rulers with cosmic language because human rulers can embody something larger than themselves. Babylon is not just a king. Babylon is arrogance organized. Babylon is domination with architecture. Babylon is the human will to ascend and seize the throne. So even if Isaiah 14 is not originally about Satan as a fallen angel, it absolutely gives us the shape of satanic pride. I will ascend. I will raise my throne. I will make myself like the Most High. That is the voice of empire. By the time later readers connect that voice with the devil, they are not inventing the connection out of nothing. They are noticing a pattern. Power always wants to rise. Empire always wants heaven. The creature always wants the throne. Ezekiel 28 works similarly. This passage is often used alongside Isaiah 14 to describe Satan's fall. It speaks of someone in Eden, adorned with precious stones, an anointed cherub of the holy mountain of God. Enormous. It sounds angelic. It sounds pre-human. It sounds like more than a normal king. But again, Ezekiel tells us the target, the king of Tyre, a human ruler whose wealth and maritime power have made him think he's divine. The key line comes earlier in the chapter. Because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am God, yet you are but a man. You are but a man. That is the accusation. The king has confused wealth with divinity. He has mistaken trade power for eternal glory. He has become so inflated by his own abundance that the prophet has to use Eden and cherubim and holy mountain imagery to describe the scale of the delusion. Again, this is not a clean origin story for the devil. It is a warning about what happens when human power becomes mythic in its own mind. And that might be even more useful, because maybe the question is not, were Isaiah and Ezekiel secretly writing about Satan? Maybe the better question is, why do human empires keep looking like him? Why does Babylon sound like Satan? Why does Tyre sound like Satan? Why does concentrated power keep speaking in the voice of assent? Why does every empire eventually say, I will be like the Most High? That is the thread. The devil is not only a character, he's a pattern. And that pattern keeps showing up whenever power forgets it's mortal. But the story does not stop with Isaiah and Ezekiel. By the time we get into the Second Temple period, the centuries between the later Hebrew scriptures and the world of Jesus, Jewish thought about evil becomes far more populated. This period is strange, creative, and absolutely essential if we want to understand the New Testament, because Jesus does not enter a world where people are only reading Genesis, Job, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. He enters a world shaped by centuries of apocalyptic imagination. People are reading and telling stories about angels, demons, watchers, rebel spirits, cosmic warfare, and the origin of evil. This is where the figure of the devil becomes surrounded by other names: Mastema, Belial, Azazel, the Watchers, unclean spirits, sons of darkness. The Jewish imagination is trying to explain not only why humans sin, but why the world feels invaded by corruption. One of the more important traditions comes from the strange story in Genesis 6. Genesis gives us a brief and mysterious scene, the sons of God. The sons of God see that human women are beautiful, take them as wives, and the Nephilim appear in the land. The text moves quickly. It does not explain much. It leaves a lot unsaid. But later Jewish imagination did not leave it alone. The book of Enoch expands that tiny biblical thread into a full-blown story of cosmic rebellion. In Enoch, the sons of God become the Watchers, angelic beings assigned to watch over the world. But instead of keeping their proper place, they descend. They cross a boundary. They take human women, they produce giant offspring, and they teach humanity knowledge it was not meant to have. This is not just lust. It is corruption. Azazel teaches weapons of war, swords, knives, shields, breastplates. Others teach sorcery, astrology, enchantments, root cutting, and the manipulation of the natural world. Even beauty becomes weaponized. The use of cosmetics and ornamentation appear in the story as part of seduction and corruption. Now, modern listeners may hear that and think, that's a strange list. And it is. But the underlying idea is powerful. Evil comes when gifts are torn out of order. Knowledge is not evil. Beauty is not evil. Craft is not evil. Technology is not evil. But when knowledge is severed from wisdom, it becomes domination. When beauty is severed from love, it becomes manipulation. When craft is severed from goodness, it becomes war. That is what the Watcher story is trying to name. Evil's not always the invention of something new. Sometimes evil is the corruption of something good. And according to Enoch, when the giants die, their spirits remain on the earth as unclean spirits. This becomes one explanation for demons. That matters for the Gospels, because by the time Jesus is casting out unclean spirits, many in his audience would have had some version of this story in the background. Demons were not just random monsters. They were the lingering wreckage of an ancient corruption. They were the aftermath of a world invaded by disordered powers. That gives the ministry of Jesus a different feel. When Jesus casts out demons, he is not merely helping troubled individuals. He is confronting the residue of an old rebellion. He is cleaning up the world. Then there is Mastema. Mastema appears in the book of Jubilees, and he is one of the most fascinating transitional figures in this whole development. His name means something like hostility. And in Jubilees, Mastema often takes on roles that older biblical texts attribute more directly to God. This is especially important because it shows the same theological movement we saw with Samuel and Chronicles. Some stories in the Hebrew Bible are uncomfortable. God tests Abraham. God hardens Pharaoh's heart. God appears in strange and sometimes dangerous ways. Later Jewish writers sometimes struggle with that, not because they are less faithful, because they are trying to preserve God's goodness while still taking the story seriously. So Mastema becomes a kind of adversarial agent inside the narrative. A stunt double is probably too casual, but he gets close to the idea. He performs some of the darker roles that later readers are reluctant to place directly in God's hand. He suggests the testing of Abraham. He is involved in Pharaoh's resistance. He functions as hostility with permission. That is important, because Mastema is not simply Satan, as we later imagine him. He is not fully outside God's control. He is not an equal opposite. He is still subordinate. But he is more malicious than the courtroom prosecutor. The adversary is darkening. The tester is becoming more hostile. The figure is moving. You can feel the evolution happening. Then we come to Belial. At Qumran, among the community connected with the Dead Sea Scrolls, Belial becomes one of the main names for the leader of darkness. This is a deeply apocalyptic world. The community sees itself as the sons of light, standing against the sons of darkness. History is moving toward a final conflict. Evil is organized. The world is divided. There is a spirit of truth and a spirit of falsehood. Belial is not merely a tempter whispering in someone's ear. Belial is the head of a domain, the leader of a camp, the prince of opposition. This is where the adversary has moved a long way from the courtroom. We are now in cosmic war language. Light and darkness, truth and falsehood, God and Belial. And when you understand that, the New Testament starts to sound less strange. When Jesus talks about Satan having a kingdom, he is not inventing that idea from scratch. When Paul talks about powers and principalities, he is speaking into a world that already imagines evil as organized and suprahuman. When Revelation speaks of a dragon behind empire, it is drawing from an apocalyptic imagination that it had been developing for centuries. By the time Jesus arrives, the devil is not one simple idea. He is an accumulation. The Hebrew adversary, the courtroom accuser, the inciter of David, the cosmic rebel, the fallen star, the prince of demons, the leader of darkness, the explanation for suffering, the enemy behind empire. That is a lot. But that is also why the New Testament can speak the way it does without stopping to define everything. The language is already loaded. When Jesus says Satan, he is speaking into a world where the word carries centuries of theological pressure. And this brings us back to the idea of thin spots. Every theology has them. Places where the official explanation does not quite cover the human experience. Places where the story has gaps. Places where people keep asking questions because the answers they inherited do not feel large enough. For ancient Israel, one of the thin spots was evil. Where does it come from? Is it God's judgment? Human rebellion? Angelic corruption? Material violence? Internal desire? A cosmic enemy? The answer developed over time because the question kept deepening. And maybe that should not bother us as much as it often does. We sometimes assume that theological development is a problem, as if a belief is only valid if it appears fully formed at the beginning. But Scripture itself does not work that way. Ideas unfold, language grows, symbols gather weight. The Bible is not flat. The understanding of kingship develops. The understanding of wisdom develops. The understanding of resurrection develops. The understanding of a Messiah develops. So why would the understanding of evil remain static? The devil develops because Israel keeps wrestling with the same terrible reality from different historical locations. In the court, evil looks like accusation. In exile, it looks like empire. In apocalyptic imagination, it looks like cosmic war. In the Watcher tradition, it looks like angelic corruption. In Jubilees, it looks like hostile testing. At Qumran, it looks like Belial leading the darkness. Each one is trying to name something real. Not always in the same way, not always with the same vocabulary, but always pressing on the same wound. Something is wrong with the world. Something resists God. Something corrupts what was made good. Something accuses. Something dominates. Something lies. Something wants the throne. By the time Jesus steps onto the scene, that something has many names, but one of the most common is Satan. And next time, we'll look at what Jesus does with that word, because Jesus inherits all of this: the accuser, the cosmic rebel, the demons, the internal impulse, the kingdoms of the world. And he does something deeply interesting. He refuses to treat Satan as merely one thing. In the wilderness, Satan offers him empire without the cross. In Peter, Satan appears as the voice trying to avoid suffering. In exorcisms, Satan is the strong man whose house is being plundered. In John, Satan is the ruler of this world and the father of lies. In Paul, evil becomes powers and principalities, structures that seem to have a life of their own. So if episode 1 was about the adversary in the court, and episode 2 has been about the accuser becoming the cosmic rebel, episode 3 is where the question gets close to home. Because the devil is not only out there, the adversary is also in here. In desire, in fear, in systems, in the machinery of domination, in the temptation to take the kingdoms without the cross. And maybe that is where this whole conversation becomes dangerous. Because it is one thing to ask whether ancient people believed in demons. It is another thing to ask where the demonic is still at work, where good gifts have been twisted, where power has mistaken itself for God, where accusation has replaced restoration, where the systems we build have started demanding sacrifice. That's where we'll go next. Thanks for slowing things down with me.